And then the magic happens.
Okay.
Sheila?
Okay. Hello, everybody. We're very pleased to introduce you our keynote speaker this afternoon, André van der Hoek, who we are going to thanks a lot for being here with us. And thanks also to CBSoft for the whole entire school. Thank you very much, André, for being here with us. I'm going to introduce our keynote. André van der Hoek is a professor at the Department of Informatics at the University of California in Irvine, and heads the Software Design and Collaboration Laboratory, which focuses on understanding and advancing the roles of design, collaboration, and education in software engineering. He's co-author of Software Design Decoded, 66 Ways How Experts Think, and co-editor of Studying Professional Software Design, a human-centric look at design work. 2 books that detail the expert practice of professional software designers. He has authored and co-authored over 100 peer-reviewed journal and conference publications, and in 2006, was a recipient of an CBSoft Distinguished Paper Award. He was recognized as an ACM Distinguished Scientist in 2013, and in 2009, he was a recipient of the Premier Award of Excellence in Engineering Education courseware. He's the principal designer of the Bachelor in Informatics at UC Irvine, and was honored in 2005 as UC Irvine Professor of the Year for his outstanding innovative educational contributions. He holds a joint bachelor and master's degree in business-oriented computer science from Erasmus University Rotterdam, Netherlands, and a PhD degree in computer science from the University of Colorado at Boulder. We are really, really excited to hear you, André. Please be our guest.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Ivan, Ivan and Alfredo for inviting me to give this keynote. I am beyond excited to be here. As some of you know, Brazil is totally one of my favorite countries, and some of my favorite friends are in Brazil. I like to visit when I can. It's been too long. I'm talking to my family about coming out again, but we'll see what we can do. Kids in high school get in the way. So that said, I'm here, and I'm going to give what I think is a somewhat unusual talk. I hope it's an unusual talk. In talking with Alfredo and Ivan, we talked a lot about, what might be beneficial for those in an early career. And so this talk is really a retrospective about my own career and how I got to where I got. And for those of you who know me, I do a lot of work in software design in terms of research and education. But I titled the talk a non-designed career because my career was definitely not designed at all. So I'm going to show you what that actually means. Now it should switch slides. There we go. So here's the abstract, right? And I think it's worthwhile actually reading the abstract. So academic careers can be challenging, and much is said about how one should go about them. Everybody tells you need to write papers, you need to do this service, you need to do review, you need to teach, you need to be friendly to your colleagues, you need to get funding. There's a lot of pressure. That said, every career is unique. Everybody is their own individual person. And every career is often shaped almost by happenstance rather than by design, right? There's things that happen in your life that help arrive you where you are. So in this talk, I'm going to give you the tour of my career, anchored by what I consider some of the key research projects and results, although they take a backseat because I will be sharing more the many peculiar and fortunate circumstances that shape the projects and results. So how did I get to where I got? I'll touch upon some of the lessons that I had to learn, some of my amazing colleagues, you'll see some pictures, and the role that they played, and hopefully in the process, demystify some of what is often considered the straitjacket of how one is to be an academic, right? Because here's how you should be, and if you do it this way, then all is good. So this is me, when you see me not through a little Zoom window. So I am a first-generation college grad, which means that my dad was a police officer. He never finished high school. My mom was working as a secretary at a butter factory in the Netherlands. And when my mom and dad met and I showed up, she quit working to take care of me and my sister. And so, that was way back in the Netherlands, and I'll return to that important fact. So if I normally were to introduce myself, right, as part of a normal talk, I would start something like this. I'd say, I'm André van der Hoek. I'm pleased to be here. Here's the areas of research that I care about. So I care a lot about collaboration. How do software developers work together? And how can we make their lives better and easier in doing that? Which today, of course, in a distributed and hybrid world is again, a very important question. I have a big interest in design. How do professional software developers actually design the software that they create? Because I feel like we don't know enough about that. But there's also an overlap with education. I really, really like my work to actually be educationally relevant. And so I bring a lot of the research into the classroom. And then the big oval says the environment, right? So what is the actual setting in which we do our collaboration and our design work? So that used to be design work at the whiteboard. Now we're doing design work in a distributed setting. So what are some questions that are there? I like my work to definitely be practical. I like my work to be connected to what happens in the industry. I like it to be inspired by the problems that software developers have in the industry. So I don't like really sitting here sort of in the ivory tower of academia and just coming up with my own inventions and they not really connecting to what's out there. That said, I do like my research to have a theoretical basis. So what's the level of understanding of why certain solutions that I might design work or why they don't work? And ideally, I like my work to have educational benefits. As I said, I like to bring it back into the classroom. I take a very strong tool-driven approach. So I like actually designing and building. I don't get to program enough anymore, actually not at all at the moment, which is very sad. So my grad students, undergrad students, master students, they all do most of the work for me. But here's just an overview of some of the tools that we've produced and published over the years, ranging from Palantir, which was a very early in 2001 to work about distributed configuration management, to a project on the right side that's called NoCap, which is pertinent today, where we're talking about when people are designing together, particularly in a remote setting, how can you actually capture what they say in an easy and relevant way for later reuse? I'm not going to go into all the projects. I'll talk about them in a little bit. But certainly, I would say that's sort of my hallmark is when my research comes out, it often is centered on a certain tool. I might even talk about my key accomplishments. So I have now greater than 125 papers. I have more than $10 million worth in funding. I wrote a book together with Marion Petra in the UK. I co-edited a couple of books. I served as ICSI-PC co-chair. I served as FSC-PC co-chair, PC chair by myself. I served as department chair for informatics for 10 years, as associate dean for 2 years, equity advisor for 2 years. I've graduated some 10 PhD students and probably more than 100 masters and undergrad students, if not more. So by all means, right, one can look at me as, yeah, he's a fairly successful person in the field. And anybody who knows me knows that I hate putting this slide up. So I'm doing this to say, I've had a good career. So I'm happy and proud of that. I certainly have not written as many papers as some others. I've not had as much funding as others. I've not written as many books as others. But I'm really happy with where I am at and the breadth of experiences that I have had the pleasure of doing, right? Department chair is somewhat unusual. I did it for 10 years. I was ICSI-PC co-chair, that was great, and a bunch of other things. So one could ask, how'd you do that? Right? This is, you're a somewhat successful researcher. How did you do that? How did you design? How did you strategize your career? And if you actually go out and look on the internet, there's a lot of material out there, right? How to be a successful academic, or how to be a successful young researcher, or here are the metrics by which you need to perform. So I talk a lot to junior professors, and some of them are at institutions and their chair tells them, 3 papers in journals every single year, or 4 papers in journals every single year. And here's how you need to do that. And whenever you go to a conference, you need to talk to this person, that person, that person, that person. There's all this wisdom of how you should go about your career. And in some ways, there's a lot of truth to it. You do have to publish. You do have to kind of talk to people. But do you have to really carefully sort of plan every single day and every single activity and every single person that you're going to talk to? Well, I was looking at the talk from yesterday, Carolyn's talk, and she mentioned lesson number 2. And lesson number 2 is embrace the randomness of life. And when I saw that, I immediately emailed her and said, thank you, because you're setting up my talk perfectly, because that's exactly what I want to talk about. I want to talk about the randomness of life and sort of forgetting some of the strategies because you can get lost in them. And how you might also go about working on your career more in a reflective, intuitive, true to yourself kind of manner. And the randomness of life certainly plays a role there. So I'm going to reintroduce myself, right? So I just introduced myself as I'm André, first generation faculty member. I've done this research. Here's how I think about myself in terms of as a researcher. But let's redo this and let's give you a tour of what my life really was like. Okay, so this is me when I was about 2 years old, and there's a couple of things you should notice. One is this is on the front door, but it's not a house. It's a big apartment complex. We're living on the 9th floor, right next to the railroad, and I had a little tricycle that you can see right there. That I could ride down the hallway that was in front of 10 different apartment complexes, and then I could ride it back. And I could ride it over there, and I could ride it back. And that's what I did a lot. I also counted all the railroad cars when they came by. When a train came by, I would count how many cars there were. So this was me, and I was just a little kid, happily going about my business. It wouldn't be a good talk to Brazilian friends if I didn't talk about soccer. So yes, I did play soccer myself. This is me on the left side over there. I was the smallest kid there. I'm about 9 years old there. Played soccer for a little while, but then we got a new coach, and the coach split the team, and we were all friends, and that didn't go very well. So I ended up switching to cycling, as you see on the top left. This is on a vacation where we are maybe 100 miles away from our house. We had the opportunity to go on vacation. I had gotten a road bike in the meantime, and my cousin, who's about the same age as me, rode his bike as well. So I did a lot of biking as a kid. Okay, that actually is a theme that will come back through the talk. And on the right side, it's Christmas time, and you can see right in my hand is a Rubik's Cube, and I'm so excited because I always wanted the Rubik's Cube, and I got it as a Christmas gift, right? And so I'm growing up like any normal kid, doing some activities, focusing a lot on school. Okay, this was my high school in Rotterdam. It was 6 miles away. This is a sunny picture of the Netherlands. Anybody who knows the Netherlands says it rains a lot and can get very cold. I rode my bicycle 6 miles one way, 6 miles the other way, 10 kilometers one way, 10 kilometers the other way, every single day with my school bag in tow, with a couple of friends, because that's what everybody did in the Netherlands, right? And so I went through high school, nothing really eventful happened. I did okay in my classes, all sort of normal. Then I ended up at the university, Erasmus University Rotterdam, which also was 6 miles away, so I could stay at my parents' house still. I still cycled my bicycle back and forth, and I have many stories of cycling on very slippery roads and falling down and all sorts of things. But at the university, I started to get shaped a little bit. And in particular, I had the opportunity to become a teaching assistant. So I was done with my first year. I walked through the hallway on one of the last days, and there was a little advertisement hanging there that said, anybody want to be a teaching assistant? We're looking for teaching assistants for next year. So I applied together with a whole bunch of other people. And I was told that, you only just completed your first year. You don't have enough experience to teach some of the other classes or assist us in the other classes because you haven't taken them yourself yet. So we kind of don't know what to do with you. You kind of should wait a couple of years. But kind of all the other people who applied are very senior, and most of them are going to graduate very soon, which doesn't help us either. So we kind of have this one extra spot, and maybe you can just come in and you can teach only the freshman courses. So I helped the professors in the introductory programming courses spend a lot of time in the labs assisting students, and spend a lot of time running and testing programs, right? Because students hand in programs as their homework, and my job was to actually check the homework and see if they'd done it right. Of course, I made my share of mistakes. My best mistake as a TA was after 300 students had handed in their homeworks, for me to actually delete all 300 of those, so that none of them were visible anymore, not gradable anymore. Yes, I did that by accident. The professor still liked me, so okay. And that professor that I worked with ended up playing a very important part in my life. And why was that? Well, here's two papers that are part of the same journal, and it's a simulation tool for parallel branch and bound algorithms, so this particular algorithms kind of stuff. And the professor that I happily deleted all those assignments for, his name was Judy. Whoops, sorry about that. His name was Judy, he's right there, okay? It does it again, there we go, Judy Trinikens. And so he, all of a sudden, asked me, you want to go to Boulder, Colorado? And I went, huh? And he said, well, you know, I was there once. And actually, if you look at this second paper, there's two names, Richard Bird and Robert Schnabel. And Richard Bird and Robert Schnabel, or Bobby Schnabel as he's known, were two professors in Boulder, Colorado, who were doing some similar research to what Judy was doing. And so Judy had been himself an exchange student, maybe a postdoc, long time ago before I was there. And he'd always sort of kept in touch. And he got a flyer from the University of Colorado in Boulder that said, hey, we'd like to see some students. He goes, well, you probably don't want to go study there fully, but maybe I can ask if you can go for 1 year as an exchange student. And so I went home to my mom and dad, who were a lot less excited about this idea. But, you know, we talked about it and I said, okay, you know, go for a year and that would be okay. So I had to put together my CV, which I hadn't done yet. The CV was emailed, and then we got a one-line email back from Bobby Schnabel that said, yes. That's all it said, yes. So, and then I was there, 2 suitcases in hand, and flew over to Boulder, Colorado, which is a fabulous town. I cannot complain that I landed there. The town is right in front of the Rocky Mountains. And so I spent a year there as a researcher. And what did I do? Well, on the left is Bobby, who to this day still serves as my mentor, by the way. And Bobby is a great guy, as you can tell, because anybody who puts these photos up as official photos on the internet is a good person. On the top right is Richard Bird, and on the bottom right is Betty Esco, who was Richard and Bobby were the professors. Betty was the programmer for the team. And so I ended up spending a lot of time working with Betty. And on the middle is a picture of what at the time was one of the fastest supercomputers in the world. It was a KSR-1, had 64 nodes, and somehow the University of Colorado in Boulder had one. And Bobby and Richard together were doing some work on that supercomputer. Now, what were they doing? Well, they particularly were interested in the topic of protein folding. And protein folding is when you take a number of amino acids together in an attempt to design, for instance, some medicine, right? You string them together, which people can do, but then it folds up. And nobody knows the rules by which it folds. All we know is that it does fold, and that when it folds, maybe some of the things that we want to be on the outside are on the outside, or maybe some of the things that we want to be on the outside are on the inside. So think right now about COVID. Everybody has seen the COVID germs, right, with all the spikes. And so if you want to design medicine for that, you want something that grabs those spikes, right? And so that's what their research was really about. And the way they did it was, rather than trying to discover the rules, as you might now with machine learning, they actually tried to actively fold in many, many different ways a string of amino acids and then calculate the energy value. And the lower the energy value, the more desirable the fold used to be. And so I came in, and there was a program that had been touched by 8 different grad students, a couple of programmers, was written in Fortran and C and a couple of libraries, had solved 2 different problems already. And I was asked to start working on a third problem. And so I started doing that. And very carefully, I was allowed to touch the code base because it was a large code base, and started working on it, did some experiments, but the software wasn't very reliable. Like I would run it, and then an hour later would go, I'm done. So I started looking at it more and more and more, and I go, there's a lot of bad software engineering in here. Surprise, surprise. And I started asking, can I rewrite this software? And they said, no, you cannot rewrite this software. It's too important. It's correct. We know that it works. You cannot rewrite it. And I kept saying, but it keeps breaking. And they said, you cannot rewrite it. Like, okay. So I tried to fix it. And then I got so tired of doing that and not being able to get results that I started rewriting it at night. Didn't tell them, but I started rewriting it at night. And 3 weeks later, I showed up with a new implementation of this software. I went to the group meeting, said, I rewrote it. They were not so happy. They were actually, to say the least, that was the angriest I've ever seen Bobby and Richard. Why would you do that? And I said, I did it in the evening. I didn't take time away from research, but it felt like the right thing to do because there were so many weird behaviors. And they then eventually sort of said, okay, why don't you run it a couple of times and see if you get the same results, which of course I had anticipated as a software engineer. I tested my software, and of course it did. So then they said, oh, it's working, and it was no longer crashing. So my job became the greatest job in the world because now I had a program that actually finished and we could run longer and longer problems. And so I would come in on Monday morning, I'd press the button and say, run. And then I would go, now what am I going to do? Well, on the left, you see a game called XPilot, which was one of the very, very first client server games that played over the internet. And this is a time when Sun workstations were still the way that we worked. So I played an awful lot of XPilot. On the right, you see my bike and me. You should know that the bicycle path is actually on the other side of the tree. And this is my friend. This is a particularly tricky section. I actually went upside down. I fully had my bike above my head and my head towards the ground. I was unheard. It's all good. But I did a fair bit of cycling, right? And then I would come back on Thursday or Friday, and then my run would be done. And I would analyze the results with Betty. And then on the next Monday, we would run the thing again on a larger problem. So this was the world's greatest job, right? I had a lot of extra time. Things were going well, etc. I even got my first publications out of that because now they could run larger problems than any other university, any other research group. And while I actually didn't write these publications, because Betty was the one who wrote that, I was still an undergrad and I didn't quite know what a scientific publication was. They were published and, my first items on my academic resume. Then something interesting happened, right? I was supposed to go back to the Netherlands because I hadn't finished my undergrad yet. But Bobby started saying, you want to come back for a PhD. You want to come back for grad school because clearly this is going well. I've forgiven you for rewriting the program, right? And it's working really well right now. And I could see you do grad school. And so I started to think about it. And actually, I started to think about it and didn't quite know what I wanted to do just yet. Okay, and I'm going to pause that story because I'm going to now actually reflect a little bit, right? What are some lessons in that story of me growing up, being in the Netherlands, becoming a TA, deleting all the assignments, working with the professor, going to Colorado, redoing their program, and etc. Well, here are some of the key lessons that I feel are there. So the first one is to maintain a work-life balance. I actually I feel like I don't have to say it as loudly to my Brazilian friends as I have to say that to my American friends. Is I always feel like when I come visit, you have a little bit more of a work-life balance. You go to lunch, you talk, you etc. But it's still important, right? Research, being an academic, being a teacher is important. It can take all your time, but you're a better researcher if you have somewhat of a balance. You're a better teacher if you have somewhat of a balance. So for me, that balance, especially in Colorado, was playing the games and doing the cycling and doing some other things as well. But that balance allowed me to work on number two, which is when I was at work, I would work hard, right? I rewrote the program in 3 days. That was lots and lots of lines, or in 3 weeks, that was lots and lots of lines of code. I worked also smart, right? When something really didn't work, I would actually ask for help. I would have other people look at it. But when you work, focus on your work. Number three is do what you think is right. And this one is tricky, right? Because what mattered ultimately was that I rewrote that program. And while I wasn't able to convince them of why that was important to begin with, right? Because I saw on the ground all the little things that were not working. There were two functions that were exactly the same, 100% the same. I actually printed them, held them against the light, and looked, they were the same. But if I took one out and made a call to the other one, the program would crash. And there was lots and lots of things like that in the software. So the right thing to do was to rewrite it. But I had to find a way to do that so that I wasn't just ignoring them. I was still working on what they needed to do, but the right thing was to rewrite it. And that eventually actually led to all the positive results. The fourth one is that random opportunities arise, right? This is back to Carolyn's talk where she talked about I was going to take a math test, but there was no math test, so I took the computer science one. Well, for me, it was the random opportunity of the last day of my first year in undergrad, and I happened to see the ad for TAs, and the random opportunity of my professor there going, you want to go to Boulder, Colorado for a year, right? But the random opportunities aren't entirely random, right? You have to recognize that they're there, but they often do arise because you have been you. You have been working hard, you've been talking to people, you've been showing that you can do certain things. So often they're not entirely random, right? But you have to recognize when they come by. And the sixth one is people matter, right? So you can't do this career alone. And people matter both in sometimes bringing these random opportunities to you, but also in the work that you do, right? So in talking with Bobby and Richard, it's actually Betty who was the main person who did most of the advising and most of the teaching for me in terms of becoming more of a researcher. And so knowing who's around in your circles and knowing what you can go to them for or what they can bring to your research is, or your teaching for that matter, is actually really important. So these are sort of my first 6 lessons that are there, and I'll come back to those. So but let's talk about, again, they asked me, you want to go do a PhD? And I was like, okay, that sounds interesting, but, okay, this was my bookshelf. And the PhD with Bobby and Richard was going to be numerical analysis. It was going to be a lot of math. It was going to be a lot of Fortran programming. And I realized that what was on my bookshelf were all these books about software engineering. And you know, this was 1994 by now, so these are some of the more classic, older books, of course, that were there at the time. But that's where my interest lied, right? Not so much in being a PhD in math. And so I said, what do I do? Well, there's this professor in software engineering here in Boulder. I don't know, maybe I'll go talk to him, right? So I went to the person on the left. His name is Alex Wolf. He does not look like that anymore. But he still, I always will be my advisor. He now is actually at the University of California, Santa Cruz. He's the dean there for the School of Engineering. And the person in the middle is Dennis Heimbigner, who was essentially the sidekick to Alex in all of the research that Alex was doing. And so I literally knocked on Alex's door and I said, you know, I've been here for a year. I've been working with Bobby Schnabel. He asked if I wanted to come back for a PhD, but I kind of really like software engineering. What do you think is, I don't know, what's software engineering like here? And I still remember Alex's answer, because he said, that's me. Because he was the only software engineering professor in the department. And he said, that's me. And so we talked, and he said, okay, I'll think about it. And a month later, he came back and he said, I just got a new grant. Do you want to start the PhD with me? Because I had no idea what a PhD was like. I was like, well, maybe I can work with Bobby and Richard for a couple of years, and then I can switch to you a little bit later. I don't know. So I made no sense, right? I clearly did not know what I was talking about. But I was fortunate enough that Alex got the grant and said, you can work with me. But he also said, you can only work with me if you are interested in software configuration management, software architecture, or software process, because that's what I know about, right? If you want to do requirements, or if you want to do testing, that's not so much something that I know a lot about. So I said, okay. And so I flew back to the Netherlands, said to my parents, I'm going to go back to the United States. It's getting out of hand a little bit, but handed in my thesis in the Netherlands and then came back. So what was my PhD like? Okay, and this is an important set of slides. So in the first year, right there is an ICSI paper. So in the first year, I arrived, I didn't have to take many classes. I started talking to Alex and we said, oh, what if we build a distributed configuration management system? And we did, and I built it. And then he arranged for me to have an internship at Bell Labs. I went to the internship. The mentor left after a week. I solved most of what the mentor wanted in week 2. And so the next 8 weeks, I continued working on my own research. I was lucky here. And we wrote a paper and it got published in ICSI. Great, right? ICSI is a fabulous conference, all good. Then based on the configuration management system, I worked on a next research project around release management. We published that in FSE. And I'm thinking this PhD thing is great, right? I get to travel to Seattle, I get to travel to Zurich, I get to go all sorts of places. This is going very, very well. And then something happened. For the next 3 years, I had no major publications. Okay? I tried, I programmed, I built tools, I wrote papers, we submitted the papers, and they tended to come back with 1, 2, 3, and 4. Should accept, maybe not accept, should not accept. And they always went down, should not accept. So I had no more major publications. So this was kind of not looking too good. On the other hand, there are some other things that I did do. So in this first row above the papers, I did have a workshop paper, a conference paper with another grad student. It was his work, but it built on some of mine. So I was lucky to be a co-author. And a couple of workshop papers in the last year. I also had done something called the SCM Yellow Pages, where I compiled a list of all the tools in this particular area. And that became a website that was incredibly popular. It had like hundreds of thousands of visitors over those years. And so I kind of became known as the person who did that. And another important part of our life as grad students at the time was demos. So the funding continued, and the funding involved going to the funding agency and actually demoing the tools that we were building because they were very interested in the tools. So lots of times I saw other professors, other grad students, and I would demo my tools. Or when visitors came to the university, the same thing, we would actually demo our tools to the visitors. So I got to meet lots and lots of other researchers. And we used my tool, this distributed configuration management, in the time that there was no GitHub, in the time that there was no distributed working together, for a group of professors from Colorado, Irvine, Massachusetts, and elsewhere to write a grant proposal together. So it served as a very primitive GitHub, which was nerve-wracking because that proposal was going to ask for millions of dollars. And since I had a history of deleting things like student assignments, I was really worried about deleting one of their files or even the entire proposal like the day before the deadline, but it worked okay. So, academically, I was looking okay, but not fantastics, right? Not amazing. I was just kind of an average PhD student in some ways, in terms of my record that was there. There were some other things that happened during this time that also are important. So in my first year, I started cycling less. And then I didn't cycle anything anymore for a long time. So my sidekick, my trusted outlet, wasn't there. In year 3, I did a major change in research topic because I'd done this configuration management. I was now interested in architecture. Let's see what we can do. And so that didn't go as well as the configuration management, as you can see by the balance of the papers. You can see that I was in a long-term relationship with somebody and broke up. So that made me very unhappy and sad. And my advisor went on sabbatical for a year to Rome, to Italy, and was very far away. And this was not the time of Zoom, not the time of giving a talk like this. So we had to email back and forth for the advising, which was difficult. So my PhD years in the beginning were fantastic, but the last 3 years were actually very, very hard. Okay, so they weren't smooth. Life wasn't smooth. My parents knew, why don't you just come back to the Netherlands? You were happy here, right? Was something I would hear quite regularly. But I also knew that I liked what I was doing still, but I had to figure out what was going on. And that's when something happened. Then I got a not so random phone call. Okay, I got a phone call. I was not done with my PhD yet. Okay, I had done my topical proposal, but my thesis was still a ways off. And here is a paper called Arcadia, a software development environment research project. And you see some names. One of them is Richard Taylor, who was a professor at Irvine. And if you remember, I was doing demos with other professors, right? And other researchers. And one of them was Taylor. And when they were searching for a faculty position, they said, who do we know? Well, this André guy, we know him, he should apply, right? So it was a random call because I clearly wasn't done yet, but it was not so random because I had met the folks from Irvine over time and they knew what I was able to do and they liked the kind of research that I did and they said I should apply. So I applied, I was accepted, and thus I was going to become a professor at Irvine. But I still had this little thing of I need to write my PhD thesis, right? Because I hadn't written anything yet. And so my advisor, Alex, was gracious enough to let me go back to the original topic, the configuration management work, and write that as my dissertation. And so then I got done on time. I started a half year later in Irvine. So what are some of the lessons here, right? Some of the lessons are kind of the same. Maintain a work-life balance. I actually had a period of 3 years of not doing that. And when I was not doing that, that actually played out negatively in my abilities as a researcher and a group member and other things, right? So I was not in a happy state. I wasn't as productive as a programmer. My papers were more labored. It was tricky. On the other hand, so maintaining that has become something that I believe in, and we'll talk to my grad students about a lot. Working hard and smart, right? When you work, well, that, as I said, didn't go as well for a little while. So I started working not as smart. Not on purpose. It just wasn't as polished. My mind was not as focused on the research. Do what you think is right. Right? That's always still the advice that's there. And I did think it was right to actually switch research areas. So I did pursue that. Even though that didn't pay off as a grad student, when I graduated, I could continue that work at UCI, and I got a whole bunch of publications out of it. So that switch actually still was important, to do what you think is right. Random opportunities arise that are not entirely random, right? The call from Irvine, which was because I'd known the folks for a while. And people matter, again, in the same way. But there's 3 new ones. right? The other ones are listen carefully. Okay, so listen carefully, particularly to the advice that you're getting along the way. Because I would say that my advisor gave me a whole bunch of advice that maybe I wasn't listening so well in years 3, 4, and 5, right? He said, well, you can switch topics, but you're going to be done sooner if you stick with the same topic, right? And you need to really listen to these reviews that are coming back on your paper, because they have a message in them. And I was like, oh, they just don't like my work. It's always negative, right? And so I had to really learn to listen to what was in the reviews. The other one is do not be afraid of failure, right? You are going to make mistakes as a researcher. And sometimes that happens. You just got to recognize that that's happening. And that is the last one, which is to reflect on your experiences, right? So by the time I got to, year 5, I had sort of figured out that, all right, I'm normally a person, for those of you who know me, I always wear a red hat. I usually wear shirts that have a lot of color. And when I looked on my wall with all my pictures, I noticed that I was wearing black clothes almost every single day. And I was like, something isn't quite right. And so that's a moment that I stood there and realized that I needed to reflect on what's going well, what's not going well, and sort of get back to my old self. And that's when I finally started at the end of year 5, again, doing a little bit of bicycling, right? And going out and playing billiards somewhere and talking to people again. So that's when the important part was to reflect on your experiences and say, when were things going well? When were things not going well? What's the difference? And can I bring it back to something that goes well? So I landed in Irvine, and I am mindful of the time, by the way, for those of you who are also watching at the time. Landed in Irvine, am there still. It's now more than 20 years later. And I got some advice. So who are some of my early influences? Well, on the left is Richard Taylor, who was the person who called and who was the senior software engineer. And he got 2 pieces of advice. The first piece of advice was when I was writing my very first grant proposal. I was a very slow writer, mind you, by the way. I would write the abstract and it would take me 2 weeks, okay? 1-page abstract would take me 2 weeks. And I very proudly remember walking to Dick Taylor's office and going, I finished it. Could you please take a look? Because of course I can take a look. And I went back to my office and he was back 10 minutes later. 10 minutes later. And the whole thing is purple. And he goes, yeah, that's not the one. And I'm like, I just worked 2 weeks on that. And it's perfect. And he's like, no, that's not the one. I listened because I now learned my lesson that I needed to listen. And even sort of started to understand why it wasn't talking to the audience that it needed to talk to, and revised the abstract, wrote the body, got lots more feedback, and that proposal was funded. So he was a huge influence in getting my first proposal funded. But he also told me to not do this educational research, right? After my very first year, I was still interested in software configuration management, still interested in architecture, but I also really liked doing some education stuff. So we started building this simulator for the software process by which students could play the waterfall model, by which they could play the spiral model. And he would always come in and say, don't do that work. You don't need it. Don't do that work. You don't need it. I did it anyways, right? Sometimes you have to do what you think is right. And actually, that was ultimately a major component of my tenure. But there's other early influences. Paul Dersh is on the top right, because I used to build my tools as a researcher, and then I would say, publish them, and then they would be published. And he'd say, well, how do you know they would actually help developers? You build software tools for developers, but do they ever try your tools? And I sat there for a long time and I said, actually not. And is that a good or a bad thing? And I decided that's kind of not a good thing. So I started bringing in professionals to give me feedback, not when the tool was done, but actually earlier, right? When we were designing it and talking to the professionals, trying to figure out what we could do. And that relates to what David Redmile said, who said, you keep building tools, but why do you not study what might be needed first? And to this day, David and I joke about this, because David will always first interview, do surveys, talk to people, and then go, oh, here's a really important problem. Then he might build a little tool. And I always build a really big tool first, and then I go figure out what problem it's solving, right? But together, we ended up doing a ton of work that was really, really nicely positioned because it played to both of our strengths. But I started to incorporate, of course, in my research more understanding what was needed. And then the other influence was Nino Medvedevich over at USC. He graduated about the same time I did. And so he was a young assistant professor. I was a young assistant professor. And my papers, were getting accepted sometimes. And it seemed like all of his papers got accepted to the point where at some point, I literally, again, remember this. I said, Nino would go to the bathroom and he comes back and then he has a paper that's published. It's just not fair, right? So I started really getting not competitive, but I started to be somewhat disillusioned. Like, why is my work not? And again, it was an influence that as a young faculty member, you hear everything, right? I need to go do this, I need to teach, I need to do service. And it wasn't going that smoothly. So that was interesting. But then I got a really good piece of advice. This is Kim, she's my wife now. And she said, I hear you complain a lot about your work. Why don't you just do your research and the rest will follow? Because the mode that I had started to work on is like, oh, there's the next deadline, I need to have a paper. There's the next deadline, I need to have a paper. Rather than think about the research that you really want to do that first and the papers will follow. And that really made me stop, because why did I really get into research? Why did I like those first years? Because I was sorting things out, I was doing new things, I was doing exciting things, and I wasn't necessarily thinking about the papers. But all that early research got the papers published because we did good research, right? And because we focused on the research without the paper deadline in mind. That doesn't mean papers are not important. It just means you got to have done the work for the paper to be good. If you lead with the paper and if you always try to write a paper and quickly do the research for it, the work isn't going to be as polished, the work isn't going to be as deep, it is not going to be as meaningful, and et cetera. So I credit my wife a lot with helping me reorient my career in many ways. And so that led to these folks. So here you see some of my former students, each of whom has their own story. So there's Anita, who thought that, and I think many people know Anita, right? She was one of my first PhD students, and she did some of the early work with me, but I said, why don't we do this research? And she said, no, I don't want to do that research. I want to do this research. I was like, but that's my dissertation work that you're saying, no, I don't want to do this. It's really good research. There's a lot more to do. Why don't we? She said, no, I like this other work. And I listened to what she had to say, and she had good ideas. And she ended up being now a full professor at Oregon State. And then here, above the lighthouse, the middle one on the right side, you see Ping and Chris. And Ping and Chris were actually two undergrads who started with me and were incredibly good. They built tools. I took them to conferences because we got papers published. Then we flew to a conference, and they were in their second year as a PhD student, or third year. And on the way back from China to the US, again, I remember this, they said, Ping showed up, kind of said, can I talk to you? I'm like, we're in the plane, it's the middle of the night. He's like, okay, well, then we talked. And he said, well, I kind of think I want to try industry. And I go, you're so good about this. You have so many papers. But I listened and said, okay. And so Ping went to industry. And of course, once Ping started talking, Chris was right there next to him. And they both talked and both went to industry. They're both at Google. But they're also two people that I always can call back and I go, I'm working on a research prototype. What does that look like for you? Or this student needs to know something about a research, about how things go in practice. Could you talk to them for a little bit, right? And so there's all these stories about these projects and the students that came out of them, that each student had their own unique story, made their own unique contributions, and found their own path, right? And that's something that I will return to on the very last slide of the talk. So I did get tenure, yay, that was good. I felt very excited. At the same time, the next day I was back at work, because once you're a young researcher and you build your group, when tenure happens, the group doesn't go away, right? You still have all the grad students, all the undergrads who are working. And so the research continued. Now, what are some of the lessons here? Much the same, right? Still maintaining a work-life balance, even though I didn't cycle as much. I did get married, I did buy a house, I did have a child, eventually 2 children, and that was a work-life balance. I always made sure to walk with my little one when she was 1 or 2 years old. Every morning we would walk first before I would bring her to school. And we still remember those times, right? So that was important. Working hard, you work really hard as an assistant professor before tenure. Do what you think is right. I did the education stuff, even though a senior professor said, you probably shouldn't do that. It actually helped my tenure case significantly. When the campus looked at it, they said, that is some really important and nice work. And some of the work that I did actually still in use in universities worldwide at this moment in time. The random opportunities are still there. I'll skip those a little bit this time. But the listening and do not be afraid of failure and reflecting on your experiences, that still is super important, right? So listen to what people are trying to tell you. Everybody's going to tell you something slightly differently. It's ultimately your decision, but don't be paralyzed. Do something, and if it doesn't work, analyze why it didn't work. So I'm getting to the fourth and last bit, so I'm going to be wrapping up. Here's another connection. So since then, one of the things that happened was, one, on the left side is the Department of Informatics, where I became department chair. But then on the right side is Bashar Nassebe, who is a famous professor in the UK, actually worldwide. He's amazing. But I'm just kidding, because Bashar is somebody who sent me an email and said, you should meet Marion Petra. Okay. Marion Petra is a person that I know in the UK. I've heard you, Andre, talk about design, and I have seen and I've heard you talk about your ideas there, but Marion really knows design. You two should talk. So Bashar and I never did any work together, but he made an introduction, is that you should talk. And I go, I need to talk to a random person. And I went to her website and it talked about fashion design and talked about auto design. I'm like, this is not software engineering. What are we doing here? And so we did meet at ICSI in Germany in 2008 or 2009, I want to say, and hit it off ever since. She turned out to be sort of a perfect complement to the way I was thinking. And out of that came what ultimately I feel is my most important and probably well-known work in software design. So on the left side, you see I designed 2 new undergrad courses that are about designing software. And then the book Software Designers in Action came from working with Marion and saying, you know, we really should actually study how software designers work. So we took video of the designers of Adobe Illustrator, of Quicken Health, and a bunch of other software. And then rather than keeping it to ourselves, we invited 50 other researchers to come be part of us. And so Fred Brooks showed up, and Mary Shaw showed up, and a bunch of other people all showed up because we gave them something that they'd never seen before, which is actual software designers at work. And we asked them, just analyze, tell us what you see. And so we had a great workshop that turned into that book. Then the middle one is sketching work. Before there was Miro and Mural, my group was working on distributed sketching in support of software designers. And actually Nick, the student who's drawing on the board, tried to do a startup, but it was too soon. Had he had a startup a year later, it would have been right the time where COVID started happening, and I'm pretty sure he would have done a lot better at that moment in time. The little yellow book, as we call it, Software Design Decoded, which documents in images and short paragraphs together with Marion, documents the practices of expert software designers. And that book has sold like 5,000 copies. And as a funny anecdote, there's some set of people who will call it clickbait, which hurts a little bit, but that's okay. because there's no concrete advice in it, because it just has the image and then it says experts do this and nothing more. So the book is meant to make you reflect upon your own practices as a designer. And that's actually where we get most of the reactions from experienced software designers who say, wow, this gave me a language through which I can talk with junior software engineers, junior designers, with my team about how I work, but how I want them to work as well. And so there's companies that have book clubs, there's companies who are part of agile meetings. They will read one of the lessons at the beginning of the agile meeting and talk about it and then go back to the regular work. And so that book wouldn't have happened without the introduction by Bashar to Marian and then further work, right? And so most of my work right now is sort of in this space of design research and education. So wrapping it up, right? What are the big lessons? How do I look at this, right? Because I could have gone from the beginning of my talk and say, hey, I did all this research and, I study and I work with professionals and they come and test my software and I've interviewed them, I've surveyed them, I've gotten videos. And that would all be sort of a picture of a researcher who's very intentional, who clearly knows what they're doing, exactly figures out the path that they're going to walk. But what I sort of wanted to do with this talk is unpack that into what really happened, right? There's a lot of fortunate circumstances. There's also a lot of hard work, right? But there certainly wasn't I am going to be the most famous researcher in the area of software design. I'm still not the most famous researcher in the area of software design. I'll never be, but I've made my little contribution. I'm actually super happy with that, right? And so these are some of the lessons that we talked about: maintaining that work-life balance, working hard and smart when you work, do what you think is right. And one of the things I think is right is, for me, is always working for these kinds of talks and accepting these kinds of talks, because I get to meet new people, and these new people are going to tell me new things that shape my research, right? And that's that part of random opportunities that are perhaps not so random, right? How did I get to meet my Brazilian friends? Well, I was at a conference in Amsterdam where Chris, the undergrad, was giving the talk. And after that talk, there were two people who were battering Chris with lots and lots of questions. That was Leo Murta and Claudia Werner. And they said, and then I walked up and I go, rescue my student. And they go, oh, you're here too. And then they battered me. And they said, you got to come to Brazil because you're doing the same kind of research. And eventually I did. And that's led to all the connections that are there right now. And I have a great fondness for the connection that exists. So people matter, because there's a lot of not so random things that come out of people, but you got to be listening, be prepared to fail, and especially reflect, right? I couldn't have actually done this talk without, over the years, having reflected on my own ways of working, right? This didn't just happen all yesterday. I've, of course, been thinking about how did I get to be so lucky in many ways of having a fantastic job and working with amazing people and working as part of a great community, by having sometimes taken some risks along the way. So what's next? I have no idea, right? This is kind of that randomness, non-randomness. We'll see what comes my way. But in the meantime, I'll work really hard on my design stuff. And last but not least, about that work-life balance, right? That is now my bike. It's no longer the little three-wheeler that's biking back and forth on the 9th floor of an apartment complex. That's my brother-in-law in the middle. Him and I go cycling a lot. And on the right-hand side is an app called Strava. I'm even some friends with some Brazilian cyclists. And my claim to fame is not that I'm the fastest cyclist, because when I go cycling, there are some kids that are younger than I and that are definitely faster than I. But Strava has a really nice feature, which is whoever rode a particular part the most is called the local legend. And so I am the local legend on some areas in the area. And that makes it fun for me to be a cyclist and a researcher and everything else. So keep up the amazing work. And that's my talk. Thank you.
Thank you, André, so much for talking. A really grounded one, real one, humble one. I'm amazed for this. It's good, very good. And we are open now for questions.
Absolutely.
Anyone
Hi,
have a
Eleanor.
question? We have here Elena, very inspiring talk, André. Thank you. Any questions for André?
Yeah, I'm
Anyone
reading.
here would like to open up? There's
Yeah,
one
yeah.
over here.
I see a question in the chat, I think.
Yeah, as a
Feel like many
PhD
different happenings.
candidate, I feel like many different directions could happen during the PhD life cycle. Maybe even a first year PhD ICSI. Well, let me see. Oh, I clicked in the wrong way. Sorry about that. Maybe even a first year PhD ICSI paper could not be included in a final thesis because the research focus could change a lot in 5 or 4 years. Do you have any special advice for this kind of situation?
That's a really good question. In some ways, is there special advice? The best advice always is, of course, to talk to your advisor, right? Is to work closely with your advisor in shaping some of what the PhD is like, right? So I didn't. I did change my research topic halfway through, right? And that didn't go so well, even though I got some workshop papers. And ultimately, actually, I fell back on that first year ICSI paper as part of my dissertation. But that didn't happen, without anything happening, right? I was in regular context on a week by week with my advisor. We talked about, what the future might bring. And so it is an important aspect of understanding that the paths can be different, and maybe that's actually where I really want to go with the answer, right? So you're right that many things can happen, but so Anita, one of my first PhD students, she had a very clear path, which was configuration management, awareness, and there were always the next little problem that could be worked out. And so we did that, right? And then she went to do a postdoc with Jim Herbslip at CMU and then became our own professor. So that worked for her. Alex, one of the students I didn't talk to, equally smart, but sort of did some work and then said, oh, but here's something else that's more interesting. So I'm going to go do that. And then we would do that for a little while, get a first paper, and then he would say, oh, but this is even more interesting. I want to do this, right? And so Alex sort of bounced for a while until we talked, and I said, it's going to be a really long time before you get your PhD because there's going to need to be some sort of dissertation at the end. And you are a very creative person. You always are going to have new ideas. Why don't you park some of them for afterwards, right? The ideas, I still have a whiteboard next to me that has a lot of ideas on it because I haven't gotten to them yet. And some are 2 years old, 3 years old, and that's okay. So the trick is you want to converse with your advisor and you want to say, look, what's the direction that we're going to go? Where do I want to go? Do I want to go to academia? Do I want to go to industry? Because that can shape the research that you do. That can shape how many papers you write. That can shape how many professionals you talk to actually input into your work. So the biggest piece of advice is really to sort of be open to those new directions that might happen, but to also be mindful that there is a goal at the end, right? And the goal is to finish your PhD because you don't want to stand there with lots of ideas and lots of small papers without being able to put together a document that's the dissertation in the end. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you very much.
I have a question. May I?
Oh,
Yes.
Karina, please.
Hi.
Hi, André. So good to see you. Okay. Yeah. So if the students are not talking, we are going to enjoy. Okay. First of all, I want to thank you. You gave me one of the best advices that I get during my year at Irvine. Thank you so much for that. I always remember you. Thank you.
Okay, you're welcome.
I will not say about this advice. So sorry, guys. But I'm gonna ask you for more advice here.
Sure.
You do understand the Brazilians because you have worked with a lot. Now you are working with Rafael. You have worked with Eduardo Almeida and Leo Murta. They are they are so good, so great friends and great researchers too. And you say that Brazilians do things a bit differently. Do you have any specific advice for us? Because your advice for me was perfect, because it was for a thing that I didn't understand about USA culture and Brazilian culture.
Right, right, yes. I think there are some parts, right? So I think one part is that the Brazilian system, as I understand it, as it still is these days, is a system that has sort of a formal evaluation component in it, that you got to write your journal papers because they're worthy points, you got to write your conference papers because they're worthy of points. And that for a long time has sort of kept the Brazilian community separate from the international community, because the international community worked sort of very slowly, right? Many of my papers I submitted to ICSE, then to FSE, and then to ICSE, and it finally is accepted, but that's a year and a half later. And as a Brazilian researcher, you don't always have that time. So one piece of advice that's kind of almost for the whole community is, I love the work that all you all are doing. There's really, really good ideas, right? And the international community does need to see those ideas, because sometimes you're ahead of what I see being published elsewhere. So finding a little bit of a balance between needing to do what's important for the Brazilian career, which is to publish in SBS and other places, with at least putting out some papers in the journals. And Journal First, for instance, is helpful in this case, right? Because it has accelerated some things. To let the community know what's happening there is, I think, an important part of what I hope to see in the future. Because I see more Brazilian researchers coming to the conferences. I see you being integrated more. I see visiting more. So I feel like all of those are very positive developments, right? So figuring out that balance, I think, is one piece of advice. I think the other one is that the PhD program is a little bit more structured. So whereas in the US you can go 4 years, 5 years, 6 years, 7 years, 8 years if you want to, you don't quite have that luxury in Brazil. So early on, making sure that you understand your topic, and that you also understand the outcome, where you're going at the end, right? So there's now a form here at Irvine, because they don't like people being PhD students for 8 or 9 or 10 years. And I agree, nobody should be a PhD student on a very little amount of money for that long. That's a long period out of your life. But there's a really nice form, which is called the Independent Development Plan, where it asks the students sort of, what do you want out of your future, right? Do you want to be a researcher? Do you want to be a researcher at a company? Do you want to be an academic? Do you want to be just a teacher? Do you want to go work in industry afterwards? What do you want to do? What are your plans for this year? What do you think you want to accomplish towards that? How are you going to handle your well-being? What are your publication plans, right? And so those 4 questions then are not there to be a contract, but they're really there to be a conversation starter between the student and the advisor, so that these important topics get talked about, not just between quote unquote the good advisors who would talk about them anyways, right? But they get talked about between any pair of student and advisor. And I think getting that clarity sort of early on, getting that understanding early on of where a student might want to go, helps me advise them. right? Because I might steer one towards an internship and another one towards spending 3 months at a different university. So I think that's an important part. And the third piece of advice, not to personally benefit in any which way, but it's been great having a set of Brazilian visitors coming to Irvine, whether they're visiting David Retmals, whether they're visiting me or somebody else. But so I see it at other universities as well. And I feel like that's an important development piece for graduate and undergraduate students to have that sandwich program and get a sense of what life is like when you're really full-time on research, right? And whether you like this. So I feel like taking that opportunity, I know the funding climate is not great right now, but if the opportunity arises, grabbing that opportunity, I think is an important thing.
Thank you so much for more advice. If
Always.
they have questions, I have more questions.
Yep.
Yes, people are congratulating you at the chat. Love
may
the
I
advice
ask a
about
question?
balancing publications.
Yep.
There is a previous question from Renata, maybe.
Yes,
Do we have to read?
that's a really great question. That's a really great question.
Yeah, Renata
so the question is, do you have any tips to collaborate with other scientists around the world?
Exactly.
I think there's sort of two questions, right? One, should you do it? And I think so this is personal to me. I love working with others. I'm not the smartest kid in the room. I like working with others. The ideas that come out are more fun. There's challenges to your brain. You get to talk to people. I love doing that. That doesn't mean it always goes well, right? With some people, it doesn't work so well. So it depends a little bit on the personality. It depends on whether there's a match in research topic, all these kinds of things. And so in terms of tips, I think getting to meet some people, right, that are in your area of research, whether you get to meet them online in a conference like this, or whether you get to have your advisor reach out on your behalf and say, I have this student, he or she or they are interested in my work or in your work. It seems like it aligns. Are you willing to have a conversation with the three of us and see where it goes? That could be a way of meeting some folks. And sometimes, I've just said yes when I think Alfredo said to me, I have this undergrad and he's really good. Do you want to host him for a while? I'm like, okay. But again, that for me works because for me, one of my reflections that I didn't share is it took me a really long time to figure out that when a student walked into my office and said, can I do research with you? And I said, can I see your CV? And then they go, here. And it's got the best grades ever. That is a recipe for disaster for me. Because when I ask for the CV, my mind said no, right? And I have great success when students walk in, can I? And I go, yeah. And like on that moment, I remember very, very clearly what the Alex PhD student that I talked about, the one that had all these creative ideas, he walked in and he said, I saw your project, can I? And I said, yes. And he just looked at me. But I learned by then that that's how I make my best decisions. And so he was in, and it turned out to be great. So really, I think finding somebody who can, spend some time with you, is willing to host you, and can provide a complementary view to what you already get from your advisor, right, is another piece of it. Because if you're just going to say the same thing, that's one thing, but they're a different person. Hopefully they give you some different advice along the way. But in terms of finding, talking to your advisor, and if your advisor doesn't know, your advisor will ask somebody else, right? Because the Brazilian community is very close-knit. Everybody knows everybody. And so if Tiana doesn't know, she's going to ask Ivan. And if Ivan doesn't know, he's going to ask Alfredo, is there somebody who could work with this student? So I think using the people resource in this case would be a good thing. I hope that gives a little bit of what you were hoping for. If not, you need to tell me.
Thanks a lot. Any other questions? I think we have some time.
I have a comment or question. I do not know. It's kind of reflection. Maybe there was an implicit teaching that was, do not be afraid to work with brighter people, brighter than you, or to work with people that think differently. And this is, I think it's a very good thing, because this is one thing, when I work with a student and I feel that he's brighter than me, I'm so happy, because he can teach me things. It's not only one side. And what are your thoughts about it, André?
It sparks a slightly different thought, but yeah, so let me first say I agree, but let me translate that a little bit to something that I've observed, which is I sort of feel like every researcher that I meet has kind of a superpower, something that they are good at and that makes it work for them. And an unnamed grad student that I had, they would look around and they would say to me, I'm not as bright as this other grad student. And then they would say, and I don't write as well as this other grad student. And I don't have as good ideas as the other grad student over there. And I can't talk a conference talk like that person over there, right? And so by the end, they said, this is not for me. And I'm just not good. But of course, what they did was they took the best quality of this student and the best quality of that student and the best quality of that student and said, I'm not as good as all those best qualities combined. And it took me a while to think about this. And eventually I realized, because that sort of sparked that reflection on what is it, right? And so, yeah, that one student is really bright, but they still struggled writing it down, and they still struggled keeping a single track towards the PhD and finishing. And this other student could talk really well, but they had real trouble writing it down, right? And so everybody has their strengths and their weaknesses. And it turns out that the superpower of this student that said, I'm not as smart and I'm not as this and not as that, is exactly what you said, which is to find the right person to collaborate with, whether that was an undergrad or a master's student or another PhD student or a postdoc or another professor. And somehow their strength was to get that person involved in their research project. And it's like the other person couldn't refuse. They couldn't avoid it. It was like, because their superpower was, I find the right person and they want to work with me. And they've been very successful with this. And it's great. It's like it works for them, right? And so it's what works for you and how you've reflected on how you work is the thing that you have to stick to, right? And so for me, one of the things that works for me is I put my ideas in front of people. In the really early stages, I'm thinking about this. What do you think? And they go, that never works. And then I go, well, let me think about that. But I take all the feedback and I go home and think again, and I put it back in front of people. And that's one of the ways in which, my creative ideas come out, is because I had to teach people that when I talk, I'm not so articulate in the beginning about my ideas. You need to help me. You actually need to help me get my ideas out, because I have good ideas, but I can't necessarily articulate them. And so I've learned ways of doing that so that, the ideas get refined. But yeah, everybody's got their own superpower. And if there's somebody really smart, great. If there's somebody who can build software, great. If there's somebody who can write papers, great. And then we work with them to amplify that and compensate for the other parts.
Very good. Thank you very much, André.
Welcome.
Any other questions?
So
You talk a
let's
little bit
talk
about-
about.
Oh,
Oh,
yes.
I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Shayla.
Go on.
Go ahead,
I
Ty.
already read my question.
Would you like to put your question?
Rafael is handing,
Yes.
raising his hand. Yes.
Hi, Rafael.
I
Now,
have
now
a-
I'm terrified because he's like one office down.
yeah, I am very close to where you are. Thanks for your talk, very inspiring, as always. I have just one quick question. If you would start again, what would you do differently?
Oh, that's oof. That's a really hard question. You might have actually asked the one question to which I do not have an answer, which I expected nothing less from you. So I'm pausing, and I'll give you my thought process while I'm pausing, right? Because part of me goes, oh, I would have liked to not have switched topics after my second year of my PhD, because year 3, 4, and 5 would have been easier. And that's true. I would have had less hardship that way. On the other hand, that hardship shaped me into who I am now, right? And the work that I did in year 3, 4, and 5 laid the foundations for getting tenure. And so it's hard to say that I would do anything differently, because I feel like I am who I am by having walked the path that I walked, whether that was of my choice or not. There have been highs and lows, but overall, I am, it's almost to what I said earlier, right? I've let go in many ways of, I don't have as many papers as this one, and I don't have as much funding as that one, but I'm happy with where I'm at, because I like the problems that I'm looking at. I like the people I'm working with. And so how could I ask for more than that?
Great.
Very hard question to answer. It's a very reflective one. Diana, do you have any more questions?
I would love to talk about work smart, but if the time is all right, no problem. We can talk later, or we can talk on Discord if André has time for this.
Sure. I must say I did not sign up for the Discord yet, but I will see if I can pop on there.
So we will have another link for you, because the link expires so quickly.
Oh, oops.
Okay, no problem,
Yeah.
no problem.
If you email me the link, I'll pop on. But I do have to go teach in about
Okay,
an hour.
sure, no problem.
So otherwise, we'll talk about separately. How about that?
Ivan, we have 7 more minutes.
Yes,
Sorry?
7 more minutes.
7 more minutes.
Yeah.
I have a question for you, André. We have lots
Sure.
of PhD students over here, just eager to listen to some advice. You talked about a little bit of the need to plan. You need to listen to students and to make them plan the work for the years that come. And we talked about give space in your life for the unplanned things and the random things. And for our students, what would be your advice in balancing the random things and the planning things?
I think so. I think that is very context dependent, right? So balancing depends a lot on the moment that something happens. So early on, it might be okay to do a little side project, right? But later on, you might need to focus on getting the thesis done, right? But later on might also be okay to do a little side project, because there might be an undergrad or a master's student who you can work with and practice advising skills. So you're not doing all the work yourself, but there's something that fits there. So it's really hard to say there's a right and a wrong, because it also depends a lot, you know, on the work smart. If I go back to that, right? A lot of what I talk about with the students is, when did good things happen in your life? And when did bad things happen in your life, right? When did you make decisions that were not good? And when did you make decisions that were good? And so, as I said, for me, the method by which I make that decision is really my gut feel, my intuition. But I have some colleagues in the department, Gary and Judy Olsen, who are incredibly famous, right? They're founders of CCW. They've done amazing things together. And how do they make decisions when I talk to them? Not by intuition. No. Gary and Judy make lists with pluses and minuses, because they have learned that in their lives, that's how they make the best decisions, right? And so they go home and they make a plus and a minus list, and they add up and go, this one's got more pluses and that one's got, you know, fewer. So this is the decision we're going to make. And literally that's how they do it. And then there's some other people who go, I need to go talk to some folks. So I'll talk to this person, I'll talk to that person, I'll talk to that person. And then based on sort of the majority of feelings that people have, that's the way I will go, because that's always the way it's worked well for them, right? And so I think that the advice, the biggest piece of advice that's of course underneath the entire talk, is kind of know yourself, right? And the PhD, often I will say, is a place where students learn to get to know themselves. It's very true for me. This was the place where I eventually had to grow up. And some of it spilled over into being assistant professor. For a number of years, I was definitely still growing up. And we never stopped growing up, but those were the crucial foundational years. So part of the advice is to actually just kind of try and see how it goes, but to be open with yourself that it is a trial and it might not go well. And then you go, okay, that didn't work well, and that's okay. So some of that balance, I think, comes from practice and learning where your limitations are.
Really, really good. Thank you.
Yeah.
Any other questions, Tayana? Would you like to put your question now? We have some.
I see one in the chat,
3
though, a
minutes.
last-minute request. Do you have any advice for SE grad students that will pursue an academic career related to their future research work and software engineering education? Ooh, that's a good question. That's a good question. So I will tell you what made me pause and not immediately give an answer. I think the reality is that if you want to be, certainly in the US, although it's changing a little bit, but if you want to be a software engineering education researcher, it's more difficult to get a job as a professor in a research university. That's still the case. And so if that is your goal, you almost have to do it a little bit like I did, which is it has to be a side project where there's a main research project, but there's a couple of side exercises or papers that you write. And that then becomes interesting, because then you interview based on your main project, but you have something a little extra that you can interview with. If it's your primary topic, in the US at least, you would still land more as a teaching professor than as a research professor. Or you end up at a teaching college, because clearly you understand education. So it is changing, but not very fast. And I suspect it would be, or will be, or is somewhat similar in Brazil still at this moment in time. Even though it's a super important it's like one of the most important ones, right? But it does put you at a little bit of a disadvantage, is my impression.
Yes. So thank you very much, André. We are finishing our session. And we would like to thank you a lot. And please raise your hand, a big hand for him.
Well, thank you for having me. This is always fabulous.
Ivan, you are asking me to ask the people to open the cameras.
Yeah.
So we are going to take some pics.
Yes. To register the moment.
So go ahead.
All right.
Yeah.
After André's talk, everybody's happy.
Yeah. Please smile. Everyone smile. I don't know if you are on page 1 or 2, so keep smiling so that I can capture the screencast. 1, 2, 3, go.
I'm just gonna wave at everybody. This is good. Thank you for being here.
Once again.
And of course, to everybody, good luck.
Okay, Ivan, you finished?
1, 2, and 3.
The photo shoot session.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And thank you, André, for accepting our invitation. It was a pleasure to have you here with us.